And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook for Sunday into Monday. Looking at the sea ice on this Saturday afternoon, it's extensive across the Beaufort Sea coastline, the Arctic coast, down through the Chukchi Sea. Any areas where there were openings in the ice a week or so ago have really filled in quickly. And we continue to have some stronger winds in the vicinity here around Cape Lisburne, Point Hope. That's where we expect some of the strongest winds, along with a fair amount of blowing, drifting snow for tonight and into the day on Sunday. Further south, the ice buildup is increasing across the northern Bering and especially between Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, and then extending down along areas of the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline. Still, there have been warmer temperatures above freezing with stronger south-southwest winds into Bristol Bay, so that has prevented the ice from developing as quickly. But looking farther ahead, 6 to 10 day temperature outlook indicating for below normal temperatures along the west side of the state should further facilitate some ice growth here as we head toward Christmas. There is some ice in especially northern Cook Inlet, but pretty typical for this time of year. So on the weather map, late tonight, early Saturday morning, secondary low quickly lifts across the eastern Kenai to north and west of Prince William Sound. This is going to create a burst of accumulating snow across the Anchorage Bowl this Saturday evening into the early overnight period. Stronger front here with gale force winds, and it's going to kick in some steadier coastal rains and potentially some heavier snow in the higher elevations of the coastal mountains. Back to the west, the low that came into Kuskokwim Bay will continue tracking northward tonight into Sunday morning to be located up to near Nome by Sunday afternoon. It'll continue to weaken as it just retrogrades a little bit back toward the west, towards St. Lawrence Island by Monday. Otherwise, there's yet another little wave or low that comes up later Sunday. And across the Gulf Coast, maybe not quite as potent as systems as we've seen here the past week, but nevertheless, still some precipitation continuing along areas of the Gulf Coast in the form of some areas of light rain or snow showers. And further west, Monday afternoon, we have another impulse coming up here out of the North Pacific along the eastern Aleutians back to another low way to the west-southwest of the western Aleutians. And this overall active pattern is going to continue into next week, where we see low pressures coming out of the North Pacific, either up into the lower Bering or coming up across into the Gulf. And it's going to keep an active pattern really going across the Gulf Coast, Panhandle, southern mainland here, all the way on up through Christmas. So looking at the marine forecast Sunday afternoon, we're looking for southeast to south winds, 25 to as high as 35 knots, Stevens Passage, waves 5 to 7 feet. For the outer coast, south-southwest winds 30 to 35 knots south of Sitka, but as high as 40 knots there in the vicinity of Sitka, with waves running 13 to 16 feet. And by the time we get into Monday, winds do come down. Look for north-northeast winds 15 to 20 knots across the inner channels, waves 3 to 4 feet. And then along the nearshore waters of the Panhandle Gulf Coast up to Yakutat, winds will be offshore northeasterly, generally around 20 knots with waves of 8 to 9 feet. On Sunday, the northwestern Gulf will see across the whole region southwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots, waves as high as 11 feet off of the Seward Peninsula as well as outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. Otherwise, Prince William Sound and down through the middle upper Cook Inlet, waves running 5 to 6 feet, with 7 feet there at the entrance of Cook Inlet. Monday, winds will become variable across the northwestern Gulf. Easterly within Prince William Sound, waves only a couple feet there. As we go down the length of the Cook Inlet, winds will be northerly around 10 knots. Upper Cook Inlet to there just west of Anchor Point, waves 3 feet, and turning northwesterly at 20 knots at the entrance with 4 to 5 foot waves. Winds on Sunday across Kodiak Island, look for southwest winds 30 to 35 knots, highest there within Shelikof Strait. Otherwise, winds will become westerly 20-25 knots along the length of the Alaska Peninsula, waves 7 to 10 feet on the North Pacific side and 8 to 10 feet on the Bering side. For Monday, Winds will be kind of a mix. Look for northwest to north winds, 15 knots around Kodiak Island, but those winds will turn back toward the south-southeast and pick up 25 to 30 knots as you get around Sand Point southwestward. Waves 3 to as high as 8 feet south of False Pass, 3 feet within Bristol Bay on Monday, but 4 to 5 feet there north of Cold Bay. And then across the Aleutian chain for Sunday, winds will generally be westerly at 20 knots throughout the eastern and central Aleutians, but look for them to turn around to the east-southeast to 40-knot gales west of Kiska on up through Shemya, with waves building 10 to 13 feet there. And by the time we get into Monday, look for some sort of southerly component to the wind, say south-southwest winds, 30 to 35 knots across the eastern and central Aleutians, and then becoming more in the way of southwesterly winds of 30 to 35 knots with waves building in excess of 20 feet there as you get out across the western Aleutians. Along the southwest coast, generally west winds into the lower Yukon and into Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays at about 25 knots. Fair amount of ice is in place in these locations. Some more in the way of open water, Bristol Bay, 4-foot waves. Northwest winds, 15 to as high as 25 knots. St. Matthew, where waves out that way as high as 10 feet. Now on Monday, winds are going to try to turn back around, develop a southeast to south component along the southwest coast, 20 to 25 knots, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Bay, 15 to 20 knot winds along the lower Yukon Delta, Hooper Bay, on up into as we get up near Norton Sound, maybe not quite as strong southeast winds there within Norton Sound at 15 knots, but plenty of ice. And then as we look to the far north, first through the Bering Strait, look for northerly gales to 35 knots. And again, a fair amount of ice, though, as we get out toward the west side of St. Lawrence Island. Waves could be as high as 5-6 feet. Strongest winds Sunday will be here in that Cape, Lisburn, Point Hope areas where there'll be some blowing and drifting snow. Winds fall off as you get up toward Utqiagvik, north winds at 10 knots, and then west winds 15 knots, with ice there all along the Arctic coast from Utqiagvik through Kaktovik. And then for Monday, winds will be southeasterly around 10 knots along the Arctic coast, easterly 15 to 20 knots, Wainwright down through Cape Lisburn. And generally look for east winds out of Kotzebue Sound and the Bering Strait at 15 knots. They'll turn a little more northerly off of the eastern Russian coastline to the west side of St. Lawrence Island with 20-knot northerly winds and waves running around a few feet there off of Gamble.